Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to Day 2 of the 9th Annual Archivers Without Borders Conference. Stolen Lives, the Value of Archives in the Search for Identity. Remember that you have access to the translation of this conference from Catalan to Spanish in the lower right-hand part of your screen. There is a symbol of a globe that you can click on and choose your language, in this case Spanish. And if you want to post or comment on anything in social media about today's conference, use the hashtag ASF9J. First, we will hear from Ariadna Morente-Payez, the coordinator for the lifelong learning program of the Archival Sciences and Document Management School of Catalonia, which is affiliated with the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She will present the course Archives, Human Rights, Gender, and Diversity. Hello and good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for yet another year of putting on this conference that deals with such relevant and necessary subject matter. As Adria said, thank you, Adria. My name is Ariadna Morente, coordinator of lifelong learning for the Archival Sciences and Document Management School, and I am here to present the course that we are organizing at that school. I will give you a brief presentation on it so you can see it firsthand. Right, so as we have said, I am the coordinator for the Archival Sciences and Document Management School. I'm here to present the course Archives, Human Rights, Gender, and Diversity within the framework of this conference. It is a 100% online course, which is also given in an asynchronous way. The date for beginning is February 16th, and it finishes on June 30th of 2022. 5 hours from Monday to Wednesday from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. The course is worth 6 credits and it is given 100% in Spanish. There is time to pre-register until February 4th, 2022. It is not mandatory, but we do recommend that students have some knowledge of archival sciences or document management prior to the course. What about the goals of the course? We want to train the professionals who work or want to work in public and private organizations in the field of archives, especially related to human rights and being experts in archival sciences and applied techniques. We want to bring society closer to archival tours to manage and recover historical memory, favor citizen participation, and have greater access to knowledge and truth. Our target would be the archival professionals and document managers from the public administration, private companies, organizations, institutions that work in related areas. Also, we want to work with professionals and staff from the social organizations that are interested in human rights, history, or social research. Of course, we would love to have jurists and attorneys in the course. As for the methodology, it is a 100% online course in a virtual environment. The educational process is based on distance learning, which guarantees flexibility in study. Therefore, there is a platform that is accessible through the internet, through standard browsers. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It offers guidelines to students throughout the course, and we provide constant communication and support. It combines teaching with theoretical content and additional resources such as chats and forums that facilitate learning. And as for our curriculum, it is divided into 6 modules, the first of which is Archives and Human Rights, Historical Memory, and Gender Perspective, with 2 courses, Archives and Human Rights, Fundamental Concepts, and Perspective of Gender in Historical Memory. As for Module 2, Archival Policies for Human Rights and Historical Memory, and the course has the same title. As for Module 3, it is the technical processing of the Human Rights and Gender Archives. We also have the course of the same title, Technical Processing, and case studies for a practical experience. Our Module 4 is about the use of information, data protection, and declassification. And the course is called Access to Information, Data Protection, and Declassification, and Social and Educational Uses of Archives in Human Rights. The penultimate module, number 5, citizen participation and social organizations, mechanisms of participation. The courses are called Communication and Social Interlocution, a look on the social purposes of archives, the involvement of organizations, interculturality, citizen participation and education, and case studies for practical application of the students. Our 6th and final module stands for 30% of the final grade. The other 70% is the average from the other modules. And here we assign a tutor who will guide the student in their final project. It is mandatory to do this project to pass the course. And as for the professional opportunities that you will have after this course, it trains archival professionals and document managers to perform better communication and dissemination within administrations and other institutions related with human rights. It also facilitates the development of a career as an independent document manager and archival professional in the management of archives and human rights, and working through archives for the reparation in historical memory and mechanisms for citizen participation. So this is my presentation of the course. I hope you will find it interesting. If you have any questions, of course, I'm available to answer them. Feel free to send them to any of these emails that you see on the screen, formacioncontinuada.fuab@uab.cat or coordinacio.esaged@uab.cat, and of course my personal email, ariadne.morente@uab.cat. So thank you very much, and I reiterate my desire that you find this course interesting. Okay, we will now get underway with our roundtable, Seeking Identities, Searching for Identities, moderated by Fina Solà, archivist of the Maritime Museum of Barcelona and president of the Archival Council of the ICA, the International Archivist Council, and member of Archivists Without Borders. Good afternoon and good morning. We will begin this roundtable on searching for identities. Like any conference organized by Archivists Without Borders, the level here is very high. We share knowledge all the time. This roundtable today features our first speaker, Monsieur Mingo, then Neos Roch, Daniel Canales, and Sergi Molí. Then we will have some time for questions and answers discussion. Your questions can be addressed to our speakers through the chat. It is important that if you have a question, that you identify the person you want to ask. Indicate the roundtable member to whom the question is addressed, please, when you ask it. So let's begin. Montserrat Mingo is a journalist specialized in historical research documentaries, and she has directed many documentaries. I'm sure you've seen some of them, especially related with matters of victims of Franquism, the lost children of Franquism, the mass graves of silence, the boarding schools of fear, and others. She is now the director of the Sense Ficció documentary section at the TV3 Catalan TV station. Monsieur Mingo, you now have the floor. Thank you. I hope that you can hear me loud and clear, as I am still at the TV station. I have not been able to go home, and therefore I have to wear a face mask for safety, so I hope you can hear me well enough. Can you? Yes, we can. Very good. So I think I have about 10 minutes for an initial presentation. Then, as you say, Fina, it's not for me, but the level of the colleagues on this roundtable is very high, so let us make some brief remarks to have more time for discussion later on. I would say, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the invitation. It's not the first time that I've cooperated with Archivists Without Borders to discuss these matters associated with the search for our documents and archives. Our relationship with archives is unequal, probably because of the subject matter, which is so delicate that we have been investigating for some 25 years. In the children of stolen identities, stolen children, I would establish 3 main historical periods, and from there on we have different approaches to the archives and different discoveries. The first period of the robbery of children within the context of Francoism would be between the end of the Spanish Civil War and the beginning of the Francoist dictatorship. It was a type of robbery in which the motive was practically one of political repression, of repression against those women who were imprisoned, or either because of their own record, their personal political record, or because they were the women of, a wife of, a daughter, niece, sister of a man who was being repressed. So there was a brutal repression exercised against them, and the maximum expression of it was against their motherhood, either the cruel tortures that they would keep them from being mothers later on, the case of Maria Salvo comes to mind, or by abducting their babies. The second period would be one in which the repression became moral, which does not mean that it was apolitical, but these were abductions around the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, in which the target was single women, single mothers, prostitutes, single mothers, etc., against whom a tremendous moral repression was waged. And the motive was no longer against the woman in favor of the Spanish Republic who was imprisoned for political reasons, but they could be young women who came to the city for domestic work, or mothers of poor families who came to hospitals and their babies were abducted with total impunity. That would be the second period. Then there was a third period, and these characteristics of political repression, moral repression, and this final stage, that of pure business, do overlap each other. They have points of connection. There has always been economic exchange in these cases. The repression and the moral repression have always had a political context behind it, but in the last years of this abduction period, it was business. We could even qualify it as human trafficking and identity trafficking. I was saying that our relationship with archives is irregular or unequal because we will never find a way or a paper that says, by order of the Generalissimo, I order the abduction of the children of the Spanish Republicans or the Red Army. We will never find a paper like that, but we have found things like in the General Administration Archive of Alcalá de Henares with a number of decrees that do enable us to come up with something like an X-ray, or, if you will, put together the pieces of a puzzle. I like this example of a puzzle, even though we might be missing a piece or two of the puzzle, but it gives us a picture of how these mechanics worked. And in those archives we do find decrees of Franquism that allow children's surnames to be changed. We do find, above all, this possibility to easily change surnames, and we find a theoretical corpus like that of Vallejo Nájera that condones, in a way, these kinds of actions. And we will even find works such as that of Gumersindo de Estella, in which we can see in these manuscripts of Gumersindo de Estella, a priest in the Torrero prison of Saragossa, in which he, in a way, accredits what were the final hours of Republican women who were about to be shot by firing squad, and what was happening with their children. Later on, what we will find in the archives are often documents that show in an exemplary fashion what happened to these children. For example, oftentimes we see that these children ended up in boarding schools where they were subjected to all kinds of, not just physical, mental, and sexual humiliations, but even true slave labor. In this regard, in the National Archive of Catalonia, we have found many documents that attest to the child labor in these boarding schools. Therefore, everything that had the coverage or appearance of normality or legality can be found in the archives. But everything that came from this illegality or even legality in times of Francoism is much more difficult to find in the archives. And that does not mean, and I insist on this, and with this I finish the first part of the presentation, that it is not important to make the effort to find these tiny pieces, these tiny clues that allow us to put the puzzle together when there is no document trail, because the crimes of Francoism or any dictatorship, logically, the perpetrators do not want to leave a record of their crimes. In that case, we will have to settle for other documents that do enable us to create. They allow us to create a scenario, as I said, this picture, this puzzle, even if the puzzle is missing a few pieces. What I would also like to say is that there has been an archival acquisition after the fact, if we consider oral documents as archival documents. And following these investigations, a significant volume of testimonials has been generated that have been done in different formats, from people who have written plays to others who have produced documentaries, and they have created a body, an oral archive that in some ways is more well organized. For example, the Democratic Memory Bank of the Democratic Memorial, an archive which now can presume to be one of the most important and biggest oral memory archives in Europe, following the example of the archives for the Holocaust, the Shoah, what happened in Argentina, South Africa, and others. Oftentimes they have generated archivistic material after the fact. And I believe we are in a context in which we all understand as a documentally valid oral testimony. Because like with any other document, and oral testimony is a document in my understanding, it is subject to a number of precautions, or oftentimes when I go to do some training, especially with younger people, young children, the fact that we find a paper in an archive does not mean that it is true. That rule of thumb tells us that President Luis Companys died of internal bleeding, not by a firing squad. So all of the documents, as we must put them in the proper context, I think that we can consider valid the oral testimony as a document. That's why it's interesting to see how all this research on identities, beginning obviously with the stakeholders, the sons and daughters who search, the mothers who search, all of this volume of stories, starting with the stakeholders and examined by different disciplines, again, from theater to research to PhD theses or a documentary, have generated archivistic volume. I can't hear you now, Fina. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Well, thank you. And now we'll move on to our next speaker of the roundtable, and we will come back to you with the questions asked in the chat when we're all finished. Let me say that if you have joined us after we started, if you want to access the translation service from Catalan to Spanish, you will find it on the lower right-hand part of the screen where it says Interpretation. There is a globe icon. Click there and you can access the Spanish translation of the conference. And now I'd like to introduce Neus Roch. Neus Roch is an anthropologist with a doctorate in Human and Social Sciences. She is the president of the Observatory of Forced Disappearances of Minors, author of the book Don't Cry, You Will Be Happy, Baby Trafficking in Spain, From Repression to Business, 1938-1996. And I won't say anything else about her because we are interested in hearing from them. So, Neos, we're eager to hear from you. Thank you very much, Fina. First, let me say good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are watching us from the other shore of the Atlantic. The observatory, well, first I want to thank Montse Armengaud for her fantastic presentation, because she has laid out a context that makes it easy for me to follow, because she has explained the reality that was lived through by civil society in that entire time of great repression, both what was lived in the Francoist prisons and later during the Francoist dictatorship. But the Observatory of Forced Disappearances of Minors, we were the ones who presented in January of 2017 for the first time a draft bill in Catalonia, because we thought that Catalonia needed a law that would analyze all of these disappearances and that somehow provide legal coverage. We all know what happened on October 1st, 2017, and therefore the law was stopped in its proceedings for approval. But working with the parliamentary groups, we reached an agreement that instead of leaving it stopped there and not doing anything, they decided to form a work group and involving significant figures from the field who could make their contributions. Therefore, this bill that was our original proposal would continue to be worked on. In 2019, it was presented again, and in October 2020, October 2020, it was allowed for discussion in Parliament with urgent and extraordinary character, to the extent that on December 22nd, 2020, it was published. That is the Catalan law on forced disappearances of minors as Law 16/2020. At the observatory, we never talk about stolen, for one reason. First of all, because the international crime that Spain does not respect, despite having signed the international conventions on forced disappearance, that Danny Canales will tell us more about than I can, because I'm just an anthropologist and he will tell us about it much better, but they have not been implemented in Spain. And in Spain, the crime that is applied is that of illegal detention, and that law has a lot of shortcomings. So in Catalonia, we wanted to be a little bolder and give it the same name as it has in international law. So it is called the Catalan law on the forced disappearance of minors. This law began in 1936. Why? Because in the Spain of the Republican side, children left into exile so they would not have to suffer the trials of war. They were documented, and they left the country identified and documented. But after the war, Franco decided, Franco and his staff, so to speak, decided that those children could be recovered, claimed. But when parents began to claim their children from exiled, they found that the parents were often arrested, and mothers and entire families were identified as Reds. And so these families, some of them decided it would be better not to claim their children. These children had gone to Mexico, Russia, Belgium. Some even went to the United States. So all over the world there were children, especially in Europe and North America, children who were exiled from Spain. And there were also such children in Chile and Argentina. But many families decided not to recover them. Therefore, there was never a re-encounter with these children who may even be dead by now because of their age that they would be, is very difficult. This act of abducting children from mothers in prison was something that was imported from Nazi Germany by Vallejo Nájera. He was working with institutions called Lebensborn, where they left the children with their mothers until they were 3 years old. He did a study, above all, in the Cordoba prison here in Spain, and he concluded that the red women were close to animalism and therefore not prepared to raise children. So, first, the children were taken as soon as they were born and the mothers were shot by firing squad. But then they saw that they could not feed them because they did not have milk for them. So they reached the conclusion that they could leave them with their mothers until they were 3 years old. In other words, there are children who were registered from 1938, more or less, when this system of repression toward Republican mothers was enacted, until 1952, when they released the last imprisoned women. There could be children who were registered up to 3 years after their birth. That means that a person born in prison in 1940 had no type of documentation and could be registered as the biological child of a mother in 1943. That is 3 years after their actual birth. The next point that the law takes into account are the agreements with the Vatican, the Concordats. The first such treaty is from 1953, and here, as Montse Armengaud has said, what this began was repression against women, and especially single women, and until 1977, when the Francoist dictatorship ended. The sale of babies began above all at the end of the 1950s. Likewise, another thing to take into account are natural catastrophes, such as the children who died or disappeared in the Vides floods of December 25th of 1962 and the Barcelona snowstorm of the same year. It also takes into account the irregular adaptations at clinics such as San Cosme and San Damián, Barcelona, of which there is no way to find archives. Therefore, it is a law which, as an innovation, treats single women who were forced to abandon their minor children or their children when they were born, can look for them realistically in Catalonia. In Catalonia, we've already had a reunification of a mother and child, and children can request their documentation as an adoption law of 1996, theoretically. And I say theoretically because today there are still people walking the streets with no way to find their true identity. Another important innovation of this law is that it will investigate ex officio the births of mothers who gave birth for the first time at ages over 50 years. That is, women who registered their child who were having a child for the first time over 50 years of age. It protects, in some cases, the adoptive parents and appropriating parents. Why? Because oftentimes they were told that there was no other way to do it. Otherwise, there would be no other way to adopt a child. Therefore, these parents, these fathers and mothers, are often the ones helping their children to find their true identities. They cannot be punished. They must be considered people who are helping and cooperating to make these reunifications possible. Another important innovation is that the children who supposedly died, that is, their mothers or families were told that their baby was stillborn or had died before 24 hours of age and there's no record of burial, these children can be considered disappeared now. For us, the access to archives is very important, but not just the official archives like civil registries, cemeteries, or medical records, but all archives that could be considered even secondary, and that will enable us to find a path towards the reunification of individuals. For us, at the observatory, the work of the Maternity Hospital of Barcelona is the example to be followed. They signed an agreement with the provincial government of Barcelona, and they, as a single institution, have now given the records necessary to establish 2,000 true identities. The Catalan law is an autonomous law, cannot change the name of a crime. In Catalonia, we can call it the crime of forced disappearance of minors, but at the national Spanish level, it is still called illegal detention. We cannot change the criminal code, nor can we change the data protection laws. All of this must be done, as Daniel Canals will tell us, through the national law, nor can it oblige the Catholic Church to open archives. But what it can do, and what it is doing, and even though the law is not completely implemented, is facilitate the reunification of families. Therefore, I think we have a very nice law, and what we have to do is know how to use it, above all with the aid of archivists, and sift through all the papers necessary to find the individuals being searched for. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Neos. Thank you, Neos. It's all very interesting what we're hearing, and I like how the speakers are adding to a single storyline. Now we'll give the floor to Daniel Canales. Daniel Canales graduated with a Law and Business Administration degree, and he specialized in European Union law. In recent years, he has worked in the Spanish division of Amnesty International, where he works as a researcher and internal policy advisor, especially as regards the fight against immunity, right to expression, assembly, and information. Daniel, you now have the floor. Hello, and good afternoon. First, excuse me for addressing you in Spanish today. I appreciate you allowing me to do so. I was able to follow the previous presentations perfectly. As Neo said, it facilitates things a great deal if I can do so in Spanish. So thank you for the invitation for Amnesty International to be here today, talking about the investigations that we have conducted on what is commonly known as the stolen babies, and also thank you for allowing me to do so in Spanish. What I wanted to begin with is one of the things that Neo said about how the Spanish state has approached these search processes. And it's important, as Neo says, because one of the fundamental matters that has taken place in these years is that the investigations carried out by the judiciary branch of Spain have been done by placing the reported facts within the framework of common crime, illegal detention, false declaration of birth, or document forgery. And this is very significant because from the standpoint of international law, and what we believe at Amnesty International, is that we're talking about is truly forced disappearances. Forced disappearance is a crime in international law characterized by three elements, which are the following. One, an initial deprivation of liberty. And from the complaints that we have documented, this would take place in the moment of abduction of the boy or girl or baby, followed by a denial to confirm the fate and whereabouts of that person, and all done with the tolerance or acquiescence of the state. As it is a forced disappearance crime, it's important as regards the obligations of the state, as refers to their obligation to investigate until the fate and whereabouts of the person are determined. In these cases, that would be the time in which they are truly and legally guaranteed the possibility to recover their identity. What we've observed in this investigation that we've carried out from Amnesty International, AI, the first thing we've seen is that from the judiciary bodies, they have chosen in many cases to not carry out even a minimal investigation proceedings, as they interpreted that the statute of limitations for these crimes had expired, as they were considered common crimes, as I said before. The exception to this have been the investigations conducted by the State Attorney's Office. In a 2012 memorandum, they stated that investigating these crimes as illegal detentions and therefore ongoing crimes, it could be considered that the statute of limitations had not expired, thus facilitating at least an ongoing investigation. But what has really happened? In many cases, these investigations reach no real findings, and this has happened due to several reasons. One, the limitations of criminal proceedings themselves, which is conceived to establish an individual criminal liability. In many cases, this has been decoupled from the need to reach the truth and information on the past for people who want to discover their biological family, their identity, or the fate and whereabouts of their brother, sister, son, or daughter who have disappeared. Other reasons have to do with evidential difficulties, and this brings me to the topic of archives. When at AI we have engaged in dialogue with different provincial public prosecutors and the state prosecutors, one matter they point to is the difficulty in accessing archives and document collections that could provide relevant information for these facts. And this has surprised us for one main reason, because when we document the cases that have led up to the investigation that I've been speaking of, and just speaking from memory, I think we have collected 109 testimonials. One thing that comes up time and again was the difficulty that people in these search processes found in accessing archives. In general, we found that these people were normally in situations of little or no accompaniment by the authorities and institutions of their cases. In the end, they have been forced to become jurists, attorneys, archivists, documentalists, and these are people who have become true experts in things like DNA. Therefore, at the end of these testimonials, a common theme that was repeated was their difficulty in accessing archives. And this was manifested in not knowing where to go, and there we saw the need to improve the accessibility to archives, having a single access point for people involved in search processes. We also found that the responses they received from the archive administrators when they went to request documents, oftentimes they were treated harshly or received disparaging comments on their search processes. In other cases, they found negative attitudes or contradictory responses if they asked more than once in the same archive. We've even found shocking situations like those of women who have gone to inquire as to their medical records in hospitals where they gave birth to several children, and specifically the one on the baby that disappeared is missing, and they've even been told, "You have never given birth here," when they have indeed had other births registered, documented at that hospital. So with all these testimonials that we've been documenting, we found that finding archives was truly difficult. But when we spoke to the prosecutors, we found a state institution pointing to a stumbling block in many investigations was not being able to access archives. And therefore we thought we were approaching something that truly needed to be dealt with by authorities in depth and with the measures that up to now have not been addressed. And I will now link this to other things that Nails mentioned, such as the ecclesiastic records, church records. As has been said, We must remember that there have been clinics and maternity hospitals and other charity institutions managed by the Church for decades. When we have conveyed this concern to the Episcopal Conference, that victims were encountering difficulties in accessing these archives, we were told that many of these religious orders and institutions have a hierarchical structure that leads them to report directly to the Vatican. Therefore, they said that the Episcopal Conference could not do much to facilitate access to these archives. At AI, we then wrote a number of recommendations that do not have to do with the concordates or agreements that Niels mentioned, and from another, that the Vatican itself is attempting to promote access to these archives. It is true, and Montse also mentioned this, that it's likely that there is a lot of documentation that does not allow us to track a crime. For example, the trusteeship of women, whose documentation, as we have heard, affects women who were considered to have fallen, morally fallen women. All of that documentation, it's likely that it will be impossible to find now. But there must be a decided effort by authorities and institutions to facilitate, to the degree possible, access to archives and documents so that investigations can advance, but that victims also can have access to that information that will bring them closer to the truth and establish events from their past. As Nels said, it's not just a matter of accessing archives that come to mind when we talk about these cases. Civil registries, cemeteries, maternity hospitals, all of that, of course, should be included. But there are other archives and document collections that would enable us to cross-reference information that we may have, and that, too, is important. And this, for AI, is something we're also concerned about with the law on democratic memory, and it has to do with the absence of a law on archives. It's something that the UN, for example, the Special Rapporteur for Truth, Justice, Reparation and Guarantees, has been asking Spain to do since 2014. Among other matters, it's not just a matter of knowing what archives we have, but, as I've also said, to regulate access to those documents. Further, to facilitate access by victims, as these are truly complex cases to investigate, above all due to the difficult access to these archives. And to conclude, I would like to remark that within this investigation we have seen how when you attempt to understand the judicial investigations, but also other actions that authorities have taken, especially aside from the central government and the Ministry of Justice, that Victim Services Office, the truth is that up to now, organizations and mechanisms that have the proper structure and resources to facilitate these search processes have not been created. And this is relative to the archives, because the Ministry of Justice spokesperson told us that this service, this Victim Services Office, had as one of its main tasks something they called documentary management. But what they actually did was collect documents that the victims brought to that office, validate it minimally, but no real task to find more documents related to their cases or clarify the search processes that reach the information office. And I am saying this to give you a broad view of the conclusion that we've reached at AI when we have tried to look into these search processes and the state response to them. As I said, to conclude, on one hand, a great weight has been placed on criminal investigation by prosecutors above all, where the application of the criminal code and the statute of limitations has led to there being very little findings coming from those investigations. But when we look at actions conducted by the executive branch, when we pay attention to see what is provided to victims when they ask for information, we have found a series of resistances and shortcomings that must be addressed. At AI, we value that different autonomous communities have enacted laws that guarantee victims' rights and measures that allow all of these processes to be clarified. But it's something that must take place throughout all Spain. And that is why we think it's interesting to see the draft bill now being processed in the Spanish Parliament. And I'm sure there are more topics that we can discuss during the Q&A and discussion session. Thank you. Thank you very much, Danielle. It has been fantastic because all the speakers are following the same train of thought, and that is the strand of yarn that leads to the ball of yarn, as we called it yesterday. So thank you, Danielle, once again, and we'll now give the floor to Sergi Molí. Sergi Molí holds a degree in history. He's an archivist. He's now the head of the Central Administration Archive of the Department of Social Rights of the Government of Catalonia, and he has been a member of a very dynamic group on documentation, access, and evaluation for social support and services. And these topics, among others, he will tell us about now. Sergi, when you're ready, you have the floor. Thank you. Can you hear me correctly? Yes, please go ahead. Thank you. Well, the truth is, very interesting things are coming out today. I have a small presentation I will show. But first, let me just mention 3 points. First, a broad view. Here we're talking a lot about documentation as of the 1930s and on, and our view in document management and archival sciences goes back further when it comes to the preservation of these documents. Second, we should have a certain degree of calm, especially in terms of what is being done now with these documents. It's very much about old documentations, but also I will mention things relative to new documents. The third point, and this may come up later on in the discussion, access to archives. And I think it's a problem of access to other kinds of archives. Those that belong to public administrations are subject to different regulations, and I think that the access is not too difficult. There are other channels, other means, but there is a way to access them, and that is something that I wanted to say now on what is being done in archives of that nature. Can you see the presentation? Yes, perfect. Then let's get started. First, I will try to be brief. I have several slides, but I don't want to go on too long. The title, Stolen Lives. The first thing we think of, and as Montserrat and other speakers have said, we think about stolen children and fraudulent adoptions and the lack of documents on all of these facts. But from the document management and archival sciences standpoint, I want to give you peace of mind, because there is an entire work methodology and tools to ensure the security of this documentation, and it's not like in the past. Therefore, in terms of current documentation, today, this is not the case. And there are also mechanisms to preserve this documentation for it to be accessible. All that has been conserved so far, and that we will attempt to conserve, and that it be available to be searched and consulted. So I focus on 3 points. The management of our current documents with the peace of mind that these things that happened in the past won't happen again. The management of historical documents and what steps have been taken to preserve and safeguard the historical documentation that has emerged, and we hope even more will emerge. And briefly, I'd like to discuss the existence of a specific procedure to facilitate the knowledge on one's biological origins. As of today, at the Department of Social Rights, where I now am, you should know that there are these 2 administrative units that are very well known: the Director General for Childhood and Adolescent Services, the DGAIE, and the Catalan Institute of Foster Care and Adoption. Both are applying the Catalan government's document management system. And what does this mean? That by applying this corporate system, they provide guarantees and peace of mind that these documents are being processed, managed, and kept correctly. What else can we say? In terms of document management, we have clearly identified all the procedures and documentary series that are linked to the protection of children and adolescents. Here are a few of them, especially as regards the childhood and adolescence protection records, which is what I will emphasize, but without overlooking the adoption records, national and international, and other services related with minors. If you want to consult these, in the open data section, there is a functional classification chart of the Catalan government, which is made up of different areas, and there is a specific area for cohesion and social services. Here I am marking these documentary series linked to protection of children and adolescents. This is the main one, the one I'm highlighting, the one I will speak most about, as it is the purpose of this conference. What else can we say about document management? An entire transformation, a digital transformation process has been carried out on these documents. Everything used to be done on paper, decentralized around the territory, leading to great dispersion and difficulty. And so what is the main thing that has changed? In recent years, the childhood and adolescent information system has been integrated into an app called CINIE that contains the processing and management in an electronic format of all of the childhood protection documents, specifically on national and international adoptions. In addition to having this central information system, we are making sure that all of this electronic documentation is integrated into the main electronic archive, the corporate archive of the Catalan government, that they be preserved for the necessary time, as I will mention later. Just one more point about the law on childhood. What does Article 101 say? That there must be a record for children and adolescents, specifically a single record. And this tool facilitates access by organizations like the DGAIE and ICA, but also local governments, and within this app, management of everything around the protection measures of children who come in from the DGAIE or ICA. So that provides a framework that will facilitate any future searches by or about those children. Here is an outline to get a visual idea of this information system. It is linked to other corporate systems of the Catalan government, and they all end up in this central document manager. This gives a guarantee that the documents will be correctly managed and safeguarded. Therefore, as of today, you can have the peace of mind that these documents are correctly classified and kept. Another important matter, and it's come up in other debates, what about historic documents? All of those who are attending from the world of document management must be aware of the existence of this National Commission for Access, Evaluation, and Selection of Documents. It is an entity, a technical organization that reports to the Director General of Heritage. And among its main roles is to draw up documental access and evaluation tables. And for what purpose? To establish periods of consolidation on these documents, public documents in this case, records on the protection of children and adolescents. And this is achieved through these proposals, and it is made with relation to certain series. As Fina said, the Commission created in the day a specific group called AUD. From 2012 to 2015 they were working, made up of different archivists from different administrations to be able to contribute different viewpoints on the documentary series that we could evaluate. And here is the list of colleagues who participated: Jaume Sardà, Joan Pera, Núria Postigo, Fina Solà, our moderator today, Teresa Cabrera, and myself. Aside from different document evaluation proposals made from different areas, the main one and the reason for my presentation today is that we established conversation periods for a general system of access to children and adolescent protection records. And what was our goal? To accompany all of those who are seeking this information and data to have a table or ruling from the Commission that would provide the proper legal protection to this documentary series and determine its disposition. What does disposition mean? Is it a series for permanent conservation or total destruction. We would all reach the same conclusion, I'm sure, that it is one for permanent conservation. Once this is done, this information is provided to the involved administrations so that they know that this is to be permanently conserved and it cannot be destroyed, neither intentionally nor unintentionally. While having this formula, this table, it's allowed us to open the door to historical archives to transfer these documents and preserve them permanently. And now, getting into detail on this historical documentation. Before this proposal, we needed to have a broad view of this documentary series. As I said in the beginning, this broad view, we hear a lot about documents as of 1939 and thereafter, but we went back further to find a long-term documentary series. We found documents from the 15th century to the current day. It was not called the Child and Adolescent Protection Record at that time, but there was documentation related to minors, so we took a longer chronological view. And this enabled us to identify different producer organizations for documents, and we established, like all of you, different chronological periods. And we established a historical period, documents from the 15th century to 1939, the end of the Spanish Civil War, the pre-democratic period from 1940 to 1979, and the democratic period as of 1980, with the re-emergence of the Catalan government, the Generalitat, until today. And it's an open series because it continues to grow. We also wanted to determine the volume of documents on childhood protection. And another thing you've mentioned, we have a dispersion of archives. As Danielle said, there is no single archive on child protection. There are many diverse fragmented archives. We're also interested in identifying it, as I will show you now in some graphs that we've made. I don't know if it looks too small. If not, we can enlarge it. But the idea is we identified these historical periods, pre-democratic, democratic, and tried to visualize different organizations that could generate documents. Can I enlarge it? I can't. Well, here the first box says hospices, orphanages, maternity hospitals, casas de socorros, casas de misericordia, casas de caridad. These are like charity hospitals, places where documents were generated. Provincial Board for Minor Protection, very well known by all. The General Minors Affairs Court, Auxilio Social, the Falange humanitarian organization. So we were interested in this snapshot of what organizations, what centers for minor protection, not on here, but there are many from the administration and outside the administration, to have this snapshot from the 15th century onward. Regarding volume, we estimate, it's very difficult to quantify, but there may be from 15,000 to 20,000 archive boxes with documents on minor protection records scattered among these organizations. We hope they have been conserved. If not, we must work with them to be conserved. Just as an example, the National Archive of Catalonia, there are approximately 100 lineal meters of documents from the Provincial Protection Board. The Department of Welfare, now called the Department of Social Rights, we know that from 1981 to 2014, the date when we began with this proposal, there are over 10,000 boxes with minor and adolescent protection records, and we know that now there are 6,000 to 7,000 records being opened each year. So we must work for the historic documents, but also the current ones. The local governments have, from 2000 to 2014, 6,000 cases, 66,000 records. And the archive of the Valles Occidental, just one example, from 2011 to 2014, 3,200 cases. The municipal government of Barcelona, from 2011 to 2014, 13,000 cases. The provincial governments, with their different historical document collections, they may have 1,600 boxes approximately, and others that we could not identify. And we consulted these documents on websites, but it is a huge volume, so it is a very considerable volume, as you see. So what are some of these archives that may exist? The collection of the Directorate General for Children and Adolescent Affairs, ICA, the Provincial Minors Affairs Board, hospices, the provincial offices of courts, Auxilio Social, penitentiary centers for women, and this could be a long list. It would be good to have a detailed list of them and where these documents are located. We have tried to take another step, that is, to identify all of this in the form of graphs that we have put together in our working group. This is part of our internal investigation, identifying different archives that could be holding documents related with this subject matter. In the Catalan government, the Generalitat, the Department of Culture, and county, provincial, and national archives, us, as the Department of Social Welfare, we have transferred these archives to the National Archive. The Department of Justice has its own central archive. Presidency has the central administrative archives of the government delegation dispersed around the territory. The Department of Health, another very interesting source. Archives from hospital centers, public and private. And here there is another debate. Other administrations, the General Administration of the State, the Civil Government Archive, local governments, county councils, local councils and municipal archives, provincial governments with their provincial archives. And I've left out, on purpose, all these religious institutions that sometimes were minor protection centers, and they may have transferred their documents to diocesan archives, or those of whatever other structure they may have. Other centers that have closed over the years, from the 1950s and 60s, and we have added these ellipses on purpose because we don't know where those documents may have gone. Have they been kept internally? Or, in other cases, and they have surfaced, and we have found them appearing in some other archive, as you see under this arrow, in a county archive, a historic archive, municipal or provincial archive. But we do have this general snapshot of the whole situation. Once we have all this information, we put together a very extensive, very elaborate proposal that took us a long time to prepare, and we presented this to the National Commission, and it was approved with this ruling, proceeding number 30/2015 on the protection of children and adolescents, where it was determined what was for permanent preservation with general access or restricted access without prejudice to partial access. This provides protection. That means that anyone with documents belonging to these series must care for and preserve it. Therefore, this ruling for the 3 periods we discussed is for permanent conservation, no matter what. There can be no doubt. To conclude, and to stay on time, let me tell you that in the Social Rights Department there is a specific procedure, specific formalities for the research of one's biological origins. It is available on the website, and there's a specific procedure on how it works. There's a specific in-house unit that centralizes and accompanies people who, for whatever reason, want to research their biological origin, be they a brother, a sister, or whoever, and they can address this unit. And as an archive within our social role, we coordinate with them and guide them as to where to call or find this information or these records that sometimes are scattered around the territory and may be available no matter where they are. And this concludes my presentation. Excuse me if I have gone a bit too far over time, but I hope we can have a good discussion later on. Thank you very much, Sergi. That presentation was very interesting, and I continue to say that everyone is following the same train of thought, so to speak. Now, on to the questions. And since you are now here, Sergi Molly, let's see now. We're aware that, as Montse Roche and Danielle have said, oftentimes these documents can't be found. There are private clinics everywhere. In the 1980s, there was a change of government competencies to the Catalan government and the Department of Culture. Patricio Beras and Adrian Cruz have been making a list of private clinics and where they were, although in many cases no one knows where the documents are. But in the event that any citizen from anywhere, they could be Catalan, and that's the case you will tell us about, but they could also be from Seville or even Buenos Aires. If a citizen finds in some container at home, in the attic, in the garage, wherever, and we know that archives have been found this way, or some document collection from an old clinic or a relative or whatever has left these documents there, safeguarded there, what should such a person do? Because the problem with the citizen is, I have this document but I don't know what to do with it. In those cases, those small clinics that closed in the 1980s, I'm sure that they are, or at least some of them are, still have documents kept in someone's home. In that case, if we call out for these documents to be brought together, what would you propose that citizen do? It is a reality that we have found in centers from the healthcare sector and others, but the answer would be the same no matter what kind they are. The truth is they found a treasure, and everything that allows you to find information for a person who wants to know about their origins or know what has happened in their lives, my advice would be, from a document management standpoint, to contact an archive. And you don't have to think just about a centralized archive in Barcelona. It could be the Department of Culture for the coordination of the archive system. It depends on the content of the document, but they would pass it on to whatever department was competent. If it was health care or health matters, the Department of Health. If it was a minors, maybe to us, to the Social Rights Department. But if it happens elsewhere in the territory, there's a whole network of dispersed archives, and there will probably be one close to their place of residence. It could be a county archive, a municipal archive, and I am sure that the archivists working there, be they in the management roles or technicians, will advise them very well on what to do with those documents and support them to recover those documents and facilitate future or current searches that have to do with those documents. So I would say to be very careful with those documents, to treat those documents like a treasure that they are. Contact your local archivists for them to describe it, analyze it, and make it available as appropriate. That is a very good question. So that is valid here and in Kuala Lumpur. That is, it's valid for anyone, anywhere in the world who finds an archive or a document collection. Often we find ourselves with this question as archivists. They must contact the nearest archive, and they will help the management. Yes, my advice is to seek the cooperation of an archivist wherever is closest. In any country there will be archives scattered around the territory that will allow this proximity and facilitate management either through donation, loan, or whatever figure is necessary for this document or documents to be preserved. Thank you very much, Sergi. Thank you. Well, let's continue then. Are there questions? If so, please write them in the chat box. Well, Diane Kruth has said that the Department of Health has competencies to preserve the medical records of centers that have closed in a subsidiary manner. Therefore, okay. Danny Canales, when you talk about the refusal of access to documents and archives and they do not answer it, is it because of data protection rules? In some cases, this has been invoked. Data protection has been invoked, but that's not the only reason. For example, there are some civil registries in which for certain periods of time they claim that those documents don't exist, have been lost or misplaced. In clinics and hospitals, as said in my presentation, some people have even denied that a given patient or citizen had given birth there. But data protection laws have been invoked, and sometimes we have our doubts as to whether these laws are applicable to these cases. But I would say the answer is there are a number of different responses that are given when people have gone to ask for archives and documents relevant to their cases. Thank you. Thank you, Danny. Now, a question for Montserrat Armengol. Have you ever found any reluctance or resistance in certain segments of society when you're producing your documentaries? Well, reluctance, the obvious reluctance, the reluctance of people who are suspicious of being the actors or those who have intervened in these identity thefts. In my presentation, when I spoke of these historic periods that are clearly delimited but that also overlap, there is one thing that's very clear, and that there's one thing that goes through all the periods, that is that the actors tend to be the same profile of person, people fully involved in the establishment. In this case, Francoism, which was what we've studied. Not before that time, but when we speak of Francoism, Danny mentioned that it goes all the way up to 1996, or maybe it was Nails, because the 1996 adoption law is important. That date is not insignificant or random, because the anonymous childbirth law allowed, until 1996, mothers who gave birth and wanted to put their child up for adoption, of which there were also many mothers like this due to social, political, or moral circumstances, were able to conceal their identity. We must remember, beyond the great work done by our colleague from the Catalan government, a great task has been done to organize, preserve, and provide access to citizens to all these records. But in this case, it's a crime. It's a crime, and I don't know if it's a crime that I don't think it has a statute of limitations, because as Danny said, in the case of disappearance, until the person is found, the statute of limitations has not expired for this crime. Imagine one of these young girls who's kidnapped at the entrance to a nightclub. Isn't it true that we would not stop investigating until finding her, dead or alive, and never say, oh, the statute of limitations has expired, let's not investigate anymore. Thus, we must face the fact that these acts, beyond the savoir-faire and good work of our archive professionals, we're facing a crime. And the first thing that a criminal does is try to conceal their track, and that there be no documentary trail. That is a great handicap we face. The anonymous birth law means that if I, Montserrat Armengol Martí, give birth and want to put my baby up for adoption, there will be no documentary trail in any clinic in the world indicating that I have given birth. But if they steal my baby from me, there's no trail either. They do exactly the same thing. So no paper trail is left. Have we found reluctance? We have found reluctance among the victims themselves, because when they go to clinics, as Danny said, oftentimes they're told that the records don't exist, but it's often true, because clinics, be it for an appendicitis case or because they have stolen a baby, don't keep records all the time, nor are they obliged to keep medical records in aeternum. So there are many facets to this. We know that there are cases of or evidence of the deliberate destruction of files, but as an institution, as Sergi said, I'm convinced that you have applied powerful, rigorous mechanisms to preserve as many documents as possible. But you are the good guys in this movie. The bad guys in the movie have destroyed this material. Auxilio Social, the Francoist humanitarian organization which belonged to the Falange, Sánchez Terán, the civil governor of Barcelona by order of Rodolfo Martín Villa, who's involved in the Francoism trial in Argentina, ordered the destruction and burning of all Falange documentation. So we are facing cases, and I'll finish with this, we are facing cases of identity theft, and the first thing that the people who perpetrated these crimes attempt to do is to destroy or conceal the evidence, and that is all too clear. And let me finish with one more thing. I think we will never know how many children have been stolen. We hear figures whose origin is unknown to me. At this point, the audio signal is lost, then it returns. We don't know how many people we are speaking about. There could be many more or many less. But in cases for which something can be done, we must attempt it. Like in the Valle de los Caídos, it's impossible to recover all the bodies there because some are decomposed past the point in which it would be possible to restore the identity of the thousands of people buried there. But let's at least do it with those for whom we can and repair, the only way to do justice and have a stronger democracy. Thank you, Montse. If you allow me, Fina, to add something to what Montserrat has said, I like it that we've been identified as the companions or allies in this task. That's the way I see it. Here, we are managing documents, the archives of management, the units that generated these documents, and that when they have wanted to destroy it, we, unfortunately, this purposeful intent, we haven't been able to do it. When they wanted to destroy, they did not have our collections and the documents that had not been transcribed, so they were unable to do much. So it is worth mentioning that the virtue of our profession, we're no longer in this purpose of just safekeeping, but we're involved in a more initial stage of defining procedures, the formalities, the documents and records, what to do with them, and we attach value to the proposal of documental management and the table of documentary management that determines that these records of children and adolescents must be preserved permanently, what we're generating now and what has already been preserved. If someone wants to destroy these documents, the existence of this table would be another element to punish them, if you will, because they have done something inappropriately. It's already inappropriate to do so, but you would have legal mechanisms to show that they have acted inappropriately. We have colleagues in the chat talking about the provincial government of Lleida, the archive. Teresa Ibar says that the maternal registry books where the birth mothers' names were registered, in this case these registers have been lost, these maternity lists have been lost and can't be recovered. This has happened in nearly all the cases of the maternity hospitals. They did it on purpose, so it would be more difficult to pick up the trail. And Adrian Cruz also says that there are times in which they don't give you all of the documents, and since you don't have the complete set together, this small part, and Teresa also mentions this, it's in another archive, and there's no way to access it, and you may know perfectly well where it is, but they won't let you access it. The public administration can't give access because they don't know how to do it. And another colleague, Ana Gabadroso, the archivist of the Diocesan Archive of Bilbao, tells us that they have a protocol for data requests on stolen children. They centralize the searches in the Diocesan Archive, the parish archives. Therefore, this is a specific case of church archive. Here, there's a difference between whether or not there is or is not an archivist. And that's important because she, Annabelle Gabadroso, makes sure that all of this goes in the right direction. So, go ahead and ask your questions. Someone in the chat said that clinical records were only mandatory as of the year 2000. Before, they were not required to have them or keep them. So there you go. So, after all you've told us, Neos and Danielle, a very interesting topic has surfaced in both presentations. Neos, this is a question that Danielle can answer too, but what about the importance that is given to archives in the Catalan law on the disappearance of minors? And Daniel, at what point are we with this bill in the Spanish Parliament? And have you identified what treatment or status is being attributed to archives in that bill? Nels, would you like to begin? And then Danielle? Oh, I would rather Daniel answer first, because I will then complement his answer, if you don't mind, Daniel. Yes, that's fine. As for this bill, it has been in standby for more than a year, I think, as of July 2020, in terms of the parliamentary proceedings to ratify it. And that has surprised the Committee on Forced Disappearances, which, in a report on Spain, has indicated this blockage or paralysis of the parliamentary proceedings and claimed that a new push be given to the bill because several of the measures in the law, understanding that the parliamentary procedure is an opportunity to improve the text and implement modifications and improvements, but some of the measures established in the law were relevant to clarify these cases. For example, regarding the matter of archives, for example, something relevant is that the law establishes that there be a body called the State Commission for the Right to Identity, which, Nails, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Catalan law establishes the terms for a similar body to be created. But the importance of this commission is that on one hand it has the role of accompanying victims, as Miquel has said, something that has been missing when we have documented these search processes. And then on the other hand, it establishes search plans that, among other purposes, are meant to provide access to archives and collections. As I said, a problem in itself is accessibility. As I was trying to explain before, beyond the reasons of whether or not there are records, whether the documents exist or don't, can you locate it or not, there is an important matter, that is the attention, the service that a person receives when they are trying to discover something as relevant as who their biological family is, what their true identity is, where their child is. We believe that it must be combined with the more technical factors that we're discussing about the dispersion of archives, the accuracy of the content, and all of those things. It's important that there be bodies that can guide these processes and accompany citizens in their requests for access to archives. So some of the measures established in that bill are quite relevant. Okay, I will give you my personal opinion. I believe that Spain systematically violates all of the recommendations given to them from Amnesty International, the UN, and the very treaties that Spain itself has signed. We have a law at the Spanish level that keeps us from working. The amnesty law, Spain applies it like a full stop law. So when we try to work more in depth beyond 1977, we always find these barriers. In Catalonia, I don't know, but I'm very happy with the Catalan law and how it's being implemented, how we are advancing with it, within the limits of it being an autonomous community law. There are plans in Catalonia to create a Victims Services Office. And instead of creating a Victim Services Office, what will be used is the Victims Services Offices that already exists in the Justice Department. So it will be a way to attend to victims. This must be done with the implementation of the law. But all of this is already being worked on indirectly, which in Spain, let me give you just one example. The Maternity Hospital of Barcelona from 2012 to today has given records to confirm more than 2,000 identities. The Office of Victim Services that Daniel Canales has mentioned, which was created in 2013 in Madrid, has not even given 15 records for confirmation of identity. And with letters to victims that say things like, if you find your mother, please let us know. When I received an email from a victim who said that she was looking for information on her mother, and they told me this, that if I find her, to let them know. It's an office that, like Daniel said, all it has done is collect information, all the information it can, but it has not helped victims at all. And as for figures, as we have heard from Monsieur Armengaud, let's see, Judge Baltasar Garzón, in those children that left Spain in that first period, from 1936 to the end of the war, so 1939 from the Republican area, Judge Garzón estimated there were 34,000 such children, and reports filed in Spain only total 5,000, and only one has been brought to trial and dealt with, that of Inés Madrigal, the girl who managed to indict the doctor of the Santa Cristina Clinic of Madrid. That's the only case that has gone to trial. The rest are in the process of being dismissed or shelved. In Catalonia, there are some 400 active complaints. When I say active, it means that as soon as there's a reunification, the complaint is dismissed because people want to find their loved ones. They don't want a 90-year-old doctor to be found guilty or put in prison. That's not going to help in the process. That's why it's so important to search and search through the archives. It may be that we don't find the mother of that child, but we will find a woman over 50 years old when she supposedly had her baby, and we can do a DNA check of that woman and her child, and that DNA may help us find the true biological mother. Therefore, we must do a task of, how to say it, following the paper trail, all the situations we can for the sake of discovery. There is a calculation, an estimate from the Association of Victims and their attorney, Enrique Vila, who estimated that from 1936 to 1996, when the adoption law changed, there could be up to 300,000 children who disappeared from their families. So we're quantifying the initial 34,000 from the very beginning, and then the approximately 5% of all adoptions that took place in Spain between 1939 and 1996. But these are random estimates. If we focus on the complaints that have been filed in Spain, there are some 5,000. And there are many people who will not ever file a complaint because they realize that as soon as they file a complaint, if any documents do exist, they will disappear. We have found this situation as well, to be searching through documents, and as soon as that person goes to court to file a complaint, the hospital itself says that they have nothing in the form of records. These are public and private hospitals. We must remember that the secularization of Spanish hospitals was done in 1990. Until 1990, all public and private hospitals, there was a religious order in charge. Therefore, as Montse said, there was always a way to do business. The sale of children, child trafficking, was a business. Therefore, the person selling children in 1977, in 1978, they were still working as a gynecologist or a social worker or an attorney because they have also been involved. Therefore, the racket, so to speak, was already set up, and the death of Franco did not make it disappear. Thank you. Now we will hear from Patricia Lloberes, the head of the Central Archive at the Health Department, the archivist of the Health Department, who wants to give a brief explanation on all of this, I imagine because several speakers have made allusions to her organization. Patricia, whenever you're ready. Pat. Hello? Can you hear me? Yes, yes. Hello and good afternoon. How are you? Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon. Well, just because we at the Archive of the Health Department, and Sergi has also referred to it, we often have common topics with Sergi Molí. For many years now, we are receiving many requests for archives of clinical interest, especially from private clinics of Barcelona, which have been closing or were closing in the 1970s and 1980s. And many people are asking where the medical records of those clinics are now. And at the Department of Health, we have competencies over healthcare centers, public and private healthcare centers, is to authorize their operation and the inspection and accreditation procedures, but not documentally those things that refer to the activity of those centers. What we have done is a number of best practices, publishing these best practices for hospitals and clinics to follow, to have a proper document management. And that means that for some years now, beginning with the boom in the search for stolen children, we recovered the administrative files of these private clinics that had closed. The administrative files are simply that: inspections to see if the clinic was working properly, the medical staff who worked there, the personnel, their operations, if they had any inspections, and nothing else. There was nothing about medical records. But that did help us to gather information on the people who directed those centers. And what we did, with the authorization of our superiors, was to open a line of investigation, if you will, because we saw that it was something that had very much to do with the social role of the archive, to see if we could find any of these doctors who directed those clinics, and they could tell us where to find the medical records. But I must say that it was a complete failure, because either they were no longer around, or the phone number was unlisted, or didn't work, what have you. These small clinics closed, and no one knows what happened. And there are a few of them, and I think I've spoken about this before. We have managed to find the records, like the Santa Madrona clinic that was first on Torrent de las Flores Street and then relocated to Pasaje Menendez de Vigo, near the Paseo de Gracia and Aragon intersections. And that clinic had belonged to the La Caixa Savings Bank. And apparently the employees of La Caixa Savings Bank and their wives, aside from other specialties, also worked in a maternity ward. And following a lot of different trails, we found those records that go from 1920, I don't remember until when, but I think it's 1970 or 80, and they are in the hands of the La Caixa Foundation. If anyone, we have records of this, and if anyone asks for access to a medical record from the Santa Madrona Clinic, we give them the phone number of the legal department of the La Caixa Foundation, and the foundation gives them access to the interested parties, the family members with direct interest for everything that has to do with the data protection law. That is respected, and they are given access. I don't know if they're given a photocopy of the records and all of that, but as for the others, there's been no way to find them. We would have to hire some kind of specialized investigation service and really track them down. Now we have the records of the Lourdes clinic, which is one of the 4 or 5 religious clinics for which we have received a lot of requests, especially, as Sergio Muli said, this unit they have on the biological origins. They have contacted us as soon as they knew that we had the archives of these medical records, but the oldest ones are not there because there was no obligation to have medical records. So the only thing that we have competencies over is this sort of document, healthcare administration matters. We do not have competencies for the other documents, so we cannot. It's not that we cannot, but they simply don't give them to us. I don't know if that has clarified anything, but we are receptive to any source of medical records that may arise and surface. So we have 16 sources of medical records, 2 from maternity wards, the others are from other specialties. And that's it, nothing more. Monsieur Armingo wants to ask you a question, Pat. No, I just wanted to make a remark, and it's very important because it is a huge task, the task you're doing to gather as much data as possible. But I insist that we are talking about criminal acts, and in crime, there are certain acts that are taken for granted, and one of the main ones is to cover up the criminal nature of any acts committed. Yes, of course. So we find that even births documented in certain clinics for which we can have the medical record and that you have attained, conserved, and now it is of free access. The crux of the matter are the religious organizations where many of these girls were being lodged, who later gave birth in the clinics. A nun in Barcelona has told us that she knew perfectly well who the mother that a child was given to in adoption. A woman who was asking, who are my biological parents, because now my child has a genetic hereditary disease and I have to track my lineage beyond my emotional well-being of knowing who my biological parents are. I have a medical need. And the nun responded, well, I have cancer and I just get on with it. So there is an enormous void in the religious institutions. Some have archives and don't want to give them. Others have destroyed them. As Neo said, as soon as this became known, in many cases, it has been counterproductive, involuntarily, of course. As for the will, Danielle also said something that many times people go to organizations or religious institutions and they say, no, this has to do with the Vatican. Well, there is an initial matter, and that is the will. The will. The Archdiocese of Barcelona, the Archbishop of Barcelona, Omeya, was summoned to apologize on behalf of the Diocese of Barcelona for all of the abuse and mistreatment and irregular adoptions in minor centers of that time, and he did not even want to do that. So there are technical difficulties for following the paper trail, because the first thing a criminal wants to do is erase any tracks left behind. That is number one. That is done by default if you're a criminal. And the second thing is a matter of attitudes, and Neo's mentioned the amnesty law and the perverse effects of the amnesty law, and that is affecting organizations that cannot be considered radical, like the United Nations. So from here on, it is great that we are all so anxious and eager to search and conserve, but there must be some clear directives given to the people who search. It is complicated. It is extremely complicated. Thank you, Montse, and thank you, Pat. Well, are there more questions? I see that now the chat has calmed down a little. Well, as we wait for more questions, let me ask Danielle Canales. Danielle, can you sum up the recent report of the Forced Disappearance Committee in general terms? This report addressed several issues, not just the forced disappearance of minors, but also preparation of the democratic memory law, detention centers, the deportations in border cities of Spain like Ceuta and Melilla. It's a very complete report, and several issues are covered that have to do with forced disappearances. But in the specific issue of stolen babies, the committee called attention to the fact that the procedure to approve the law has been stalled, and they requested that it be reactivated. But they also expressed a lot of concern because the investigations into these cases that had been done by the judiciary bodies have resulted in the application of the statute of limitations that, in words of the committee, is not aligned with the international obligations of Spain when investigating these crimes as forced disappearances. They also echo the actions taken by the Information Service of the Ministry of Justice and the Institute of Toxicology and Forensic Science, and the report states that none of these mechanisms have facilitated encounters or reunifications following a disappearance, or even what we understand as the whole issue of stolen babies. When Nails mentioned that very low number of reunifications facilitated by the victim services offices in Madrid, we were informed that these are all cases of adoptions and so forth, but they were not cases of abduction or stolen children. And that is what the committee's report mentions about the issue of stolen babies. Thank you very much, Danielle. Okay, any further questions? If not, we will begin to close the session. I don't see. Jordi Moraga says that there are often duplicates of documents in other archives that are conserved. A copy is kept and may be available. Well, in that case, we would like to thank all of you. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Nils. Thank you, Sergi. Well then, congratulations to all, because it has been a very interesting roundtable. We here conclude the session of Day 2 of the Archivists Without Borders conference, and tomorrow we will continue with Archives for Diversity, our closure, and the General Assembly. Good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.